Greetings, guys. Hello, willkommen. So, in line with my recent post about Stoicism, my recent video, I discovered my Epictetus book, which I previously could not find, and I pulled it out and started reading it, and I just thought, this is a banging idea for a video series. Because the way the book is written is ancient philosophy. I can't remember if I mentioned it. It's Epictetus' Discourses. It's ancient philosophy, and it's commonly written in sort of either fragments, or like at least the fragments are all we can salvage of it, or it's written in sort of dialogues that make it very easy to understand and great to, converse with people about. So let's, I want to do some reading. I want to read some different passages and just sort of discuss what they're talking about, because I think they touch on Epictetus touches on some really interesting things in some really interesting ways. And I think what's most interesting about them, as with what's most interesting about these kinds of philosophy, especially ancient philosophy, is that what they're saying is so intuitive. It's just they're saying something complex in a very simple way. It makes it easy to understand. So the book is sectioned into 4 different books, and each one has all the different fragments are numbered, and the different sections are numbered. So I'm doing book 1, section 2, starting at fragment 1, book 2, book 1, section 2. It's called How a Person Can Preserve Their Proper Character in Any Situation. So let us read some fragments and discuss them until we come to a conclusion on that statement there, see if it's successful. So it begins. Man, the rational animal, can put up with anything except what seems to him irrational. Whatever is rational is tolerable. Physical hardships are not intolerable by nature. The Spartans, for instance, gladly submit to being whipped, because they are taught that it is done for good reason. But what about being hanged? Isn't that intolerable? Well, people frequently go and hang themselves whenever they judge that it's a reasonable course of action. In short, reflection will show that people are put off by nothing so much as what they think is unreasonable, and attracted to nothing more than what to them seems reasonable. Quite a few points in there. I mean, the first thing I think about that, or how I interpret that, is that whether you realize it or not, or whether you think it about other people or not, the defining feature of human beings is our rationality comparatively to other things. That should be intuitively obvious. And on account of that, on account of our situation, we tend to manifest that reality of our rationality in different ways, and obviously tend to be prone towards that which is reasonable and shun away from that which is unreasonable. And I think this is also a play on the words reasonable and unreasonable, because reasonable in this context implies a sort of coherence or a discernible understanding, whereas unreasonable denotes the opposite, which is a sort of absurdity or non-coherence. And so in that context, I think about, for example, religion. So to be human, or to find yourself in the world under the human condition, is to find yourself in an inherently absurd situation, right? I mean, here we are, these complex entities. There's no other complex entities quite like us. Well, I mean, monkeys, okay, whatever, but, immediately like us. There's nothing like that. And to look around at the world and all the other creatures that exist, and how harmful everything can be to us, and how we're born into the world, completely naked. Like, how fit are we for these environments? My point, though, is that it's so absurd, and there's no reason for it. There's not a lot of coherence. I mean, just finding yourself in the world and trying to rationalize it is not an easy task. And so then, for example, we think about humans inventing religion. So why else would religion exist? It's an attempt to make coherent the incoherence which is existence, to insert reason into the reality outside of us, to make the reality outside of us match up with ourselves and what we think, or to just even soothe us because we loathe that incoherence so much. And so I think that's definitely how I'd interpret it, but I think it's really interesting. The points, I mean, I can understand the points about the Spartans. So the Spartans are willing to be whipped because they're taught that's done for a good reason. So that's to say, people will intolerate things that seem intolerable if they think it's for a good reason, which I think is also true. So another example of that is being whipped for something. So what would I tolerate that's intolerable for a good reason? Well, one thing I can think of is doing things for others generally. Like maybe, that's not that great of an example, but maybe someone really wants you, your loved one really wants you to go to a play, or I don't know who the hell goes to plays, but maybe they want you to go just do something with them. And you just think it's a dreadful activity. Oh, I know. One thing that just so sucks the life right out of me is walking around the mall for hours. Just want to die. It just drains the life for me. But would I suck that up for some other reason? Yes, I probably would. Like, would you endure something bad for something else? And the answer is yes, if it were for something else, which is greater than the thing, which is perceived as greater than the intolerable thing itself. And then the next one is to leave the unreasonable, to hang yourselves. So one could argue that to leave life is somewhat irrational because, well, like you've only got one chance. Eventually it's going to be over no matter what, so you might as well just live it because it's not like it really, like you only have one chance to do it. And no matter what you do, it's going to end anyway. So no matter how bad it is, it will end. So is it really necessary to rush the end or to just continue to endeavor to make it better within the time that you have, since you will inevitably end anyway? But, so in that sense you'd say that suicide's irrational, but then they're saying that people do it anyway, so they choose this supposedly assumed as a rational act because they judge their contemporary situation, their real-time situation, as being itself irrational. So the irrationality of life itself or circumstances or whatever's happening can force one into thinking that death is a more rational choice than this. And to that I agree with. So despite my reasoning about suicide, I do think that people can rationally choose to kill themselves for a lot of different reasons, whether that's old age, sickness, mental health, well, different areas of mental health. It's a debatable issue, but it's an interesting point about how these are interesting points about reason and lack of reason, coherence and incoherence, and how they intersect and interplay with our lives in different ways. Okay. Let's move on from that for now. So so now it starts to talk about people having different standards of reasonableness and unreasonableness. So he says, for one person, it is reasonable to be a bathroom attendant, because he only thinks about what punishment and privation lie in wait for him otherwise, and knows that if he accepts the assignment, he will be spared that pain and hardship. Someone else not only finds such a job intolerable for him personally, but finds it intolerable that anyone should have to perform it. But ask me, shall I be a bathroom attendant or not? And I will tell you that earning a living is better than starving to death, so that if you measure your interests by these criteria, then go ahead and do it. But it would be beneath my dignity. Well, that is an additional factor that you bring to the question, not me. You are the one who knows yourself, which is to say, you know how much you're worth in your own estimation, and therefore you know at what price you will sell yourself, because people sell themselves at different rates. So here we've got a lot of different concepts at play. I mean, throwing work in there is one thing. So obviously we have values. It starts there. We value different things differently, and we do things for other things. So an example of the tolerable versus the intolerable actually is work itself, the kind of thing you do to earn the means of subsistence, right? So you endure work. A lot of people hate their jobs. You do that because it will lead to something reasonable or rational or desirable that you want. Similarly to the Spartan who gets whipped for some other reason, you can take work as being whipped for some other reason. But there are levels to work. Some things are more intolerable than others, is what's being said here. And what else is being said is that different people will choose different things or have different ideas of self or different beliefs about value and value about themselves relative to society and other people that will influence them in how they choose what's reasonable and unreasonable and what's worthwhile and what's not. So there seems to be a sort of play on character here. So we're starting to get into the character dimension, I think. Because what they're saying is that, I think what he's saying is that whether you choose to be a bathroom attendant or not, whether you choose to be something that you conceive of as less than you or not valuable, is sort of arbitrary. The point isn't that you're being a bathroom attendant or that anyone is a bathroom attendant or does some unfavorable job. The point is that we all have to sell ourselves at different rates and we all make different determinations of those rates and of those points of value. And that's just sort of, I guess, the nature of things, the nature of how we act, but there seems to be a different connotation here, right? Because then he's saying, you know how much you're worth in your own estimation, and therefore at what price you'll sell yourself. So what are you giving up in order to do that intolerable thing? Is it worth it? Is it worth selling yourself? Okay, let's get some more examples. So, for instance, Agrippus told Florus to go ahead when he was debating to attend Nero's festival, maybe even participate. But when Florus asked him why he was not going himself, Agrippus answered, "I don't even consider the possibility of going." Taking account of the value of externals, you see, comes at some cost to the value of one's own character. So if you want to know if life or death is better, the answer I give is life. If you ask about pain versus pleasure, I say pleasure is preferable. But if I refuse to participate in Nero's festival, he will kill me. Go ahead and participate then, but I still refuse. Why? Because you think of yourself as no more than a single thread in the robe, whose duty it is to conform to the mass of people, just as a single white thread seemingly has no wish to clash with the remainder of the garment. But I aspire to be the purple stripe, that is, the garment's brilliant helm. However small a part it might be, it can still manage to make the garment as a whole attractive. So don't tell me then, be like the rest, because in that case I cannot be the purple stripe. So I can see how we're getting into preserving one's character, right? So for whatever reason, Agrippus's character is that they are perhaps a bit of a loner, a bit of an isolationist. I mean, they're a purple stripe rather than a white stripe, so they're not going with the crowd anytime soon. And there is value in that last paragraph conveyed to us about what that person wants and how doing something would fundamentally be against, in some capacity or way, what they want for themselves. And therefore, that even if the punishment for not going, as Florus said, the punishment is death, well then Agrippus says, fuck it. For lack of a better term. Agrippa says, I am not going to be the goddamn white stripe, I'm going to be the purple stripe. But the point about character is it's kind of a banal, platitude of it, stand out, be yourself no matter what. But I think the deeper point in relation to what we were talking about before about selling yourself is that even when you do things like that, or when you like to do something that you perceive as being outside of your character is to give up some portion of your character in order to do that thing. And as we discussed before, there are good reasons to do that, to do something intolerable if it leads to something greater. But in the case of this festival for Agrippus, to go to the festival is intolerable to what one wants. There's no greater thing. Like, there's no reason to it. There's no logic to it. He wants to be a purple stripe in a white stripe world, and he doesn't want to go to that thing. So for him to go to it would be to fundamentally give up some aspect of what he wants, or to give up some portion of the person he wants to be by participating and not being the person he wants to be. So the point there, very much like, Socrates. So Socrates, once he was, charged and going to be executed, was being held in jail. His friends came to visit him, to talk with him every day, and one of those times when one of them came, they had secured a getaway plan for Socrates, and told him, if we leave now, it's going to be fine, you're going to get away, and you won't have to die, you won't have to face this. And Socrates was, said, on the contrary, it's keeping with my principles to stay here. I respect the city, I respect the law, and therefore I will stay here and die. So that's a really extreme version of preserving one's character. To preserve one's character even in the face of death. So we have multiple levels of preserving one's character here. But I'm not sufficiently convinced they've told me, or rather that Epictetus has told me, how to preserve my proper character in any situation. As that was the initial heading for this, right? I mean, if I had to speculate based on what we've read so far, I'd say that it's to recognize, if you want to learn how to preserve your character, it's to recognize reality, to whatever extent you can, and the degrees of reasonableness and unreasonableness in reality, and to discern what you think is reasonable yourself, and to determine at what price you'll sell yourself, I think implies first that you have to know yourself, right? I'm not sure if it actually said there. Yes, it does. You are the one who knows yourself, which is to say, you know how much you're worth in your own estimation. So in order to know what price you're going to sell yourself, or that is to say, what things you're going to give up for other people, or for things required of you, what are you willing to give up? So you have to determine who you are, what your values are, in order to preserve your character, obviously. And then once you've done that, you can determine as situations arise, essentially, what's worth it. So that's fairly intuitively and obvious. So once you know yourself, reasonableness, what's reasonable to you, you can determine if something will take away from your character by doing it. And so obviously for Stoicism, character and virtue are a pretty big deal, because it's, being true to yourself, being true to what's good and right. It assumes that there's an objectively a sort of good and right. And so I think the answer so far is really to know yourself and to value yourself, to understand yourself and not compromise yourself, to not do things that go against who you want to be, no matter how great the consequence. I've got some pretty funny examples in here, so listen to this. A certain athlete at risk of dying unless his genitals were amputated made a comparable choice. His brother, a philosopher, went and asked him, "Well, my brother, what's it going to be? Will you have them amputated and return to life in the gymnasium?" The man refused to submit to the indignity, however, and summoned the will to die. Someone asked, did he choose death as an athlete or as a philosopher? As a man, Epictetus said, one who competed at the level of the Olympic Games, where he was a familiar figure and a victor more than once, no occasional visitor to the local gym. Someone else might have even allowed his head to be removed if his life could have been saved thereby. That's what I mean by having consideration for one's character, and it shows how weighty a factor it can be when it is allowed a regular role in one's deliberations. So that's a pretty ridiculous example. It's a little bit uncomfortable. It's a little bit of a ridiculous example, but the point is that this person had an identity. had values. It's not just that performing sports was something they did. It's not just that they were an athlete for fun. It's that being an athlete, or using you can substitute that for something else. But being an athlete was this person's life. They weren't a stranger to to the point of they weren't a stranger to the local gymnasium, which means they were there quite frequently. They'd been to the Olympic Games. They're a familiar figure being an athlete. They've won Olympic Games more than once. So the point is that this person's identity is bound. Who they are as a person is bound to being an athlete. And for some reason, the only way that he's able to continue being an athlete is if he has his genitals amputated. I don't know why that's the case, but that's the case. And so the man decides to summon the will to die rather than suffer the indignity of losing his genitals but keeping with his identity. So there's two things at play here. It's what it means to have genitals, what that means to someone's identity, and how strong of an other identity they have. So it's a confliction of values of identities. And for this person, it was what they chose was to die rather than have their genitals cut off. So they'd rather die than lose what the genitals stand for, which is, hedonism, sex, pleasure, but also probably manhood. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like to be a man without a penis. I mean, you'd probably feel very separated from your sex, or very, very lacking relative to other people, obviously. And I suppose that this person had so much of their identity involved in it that it would not be worth it to live without that part of them. They preferred to die. So Epictetus's point is to ask yourself what's really your character. So he's not really making a judgment about character here, at least not yet, about what people choose, but rather that one ought to be true to what their specific character is. And when one allows when you allow your feelings about who you are to guide you in your deliberations about what to choose, about life choices and things of that nature, it can lead you fairly strongly, is all I think he's saying here. Okay, let's continue to see if that gets clear. Come, Epictetus, shave off your head. If I'm a philosopher, I will not shave it off. But I will cut off your head if you don't. If that will do you any good, then cut it off. Someone asked, but how do we know what is in keeping with our character? Well, how does the bull realize its own strength? Rushing out to protect the whole herd when a lion attacks? The possession of a particular talent is instinctively sensed by its owner. So if any of you are so blessed, you'll be the first to know it. It is true, however, that no bull reaches maturity in an instant, nor do men become heroes overnight. We must endure a winter training and can't be dashing into situations for which we aren't yet prepared. So part of what he's saying is, how do you know, the first question, I mean, the part about shaving off the beard and the head, I don't know what the hell was happening there, but the initial question is, how do we know what is in keeping with our character? So how do we determine what it is to keep with our character? And his first response is, how does the bull know its own strength? So in other words, how does something realize its own strength? By rushing out to protect the whole herd when a lion attacks? But that's phrased as a question mark. So it seems to be saying there, by saying that about the bull realizing its own strength and the rushing out to protect the herd, it seems to be saying that one realizes their character and their capacities, their talents, strengths by meeting situations and having them arise. But then he says, well, that's in a question mark. He continues on to say that the possession of a particular talent is instinctively sensed by the owner. And so if any of you are so blessed, you'll be the first to know it. So I'm not sure what special talents necessarily has to do with that initial question, other than, if you have a special talent, well then good for you, you'll probably know it, so don't ask. Okay, I think I get it. I get it. So the point is in the end. It's that, yes, in fact, you realize your own strength by meeting difficult situations, but taking into account what we've already talked about, you realize your own strength by first determining who you are, I guess, by interacting with the world. And the more you interact with the world, the more you know your strengths and weaknesses. And you're not going to reach maturity or become good at, fighting the lions out there without a winter training. That's what he says. So winter training would be a cold, blistering, unpleasant, very trying endeavor. It's not easy, and nobody becomes a hero overnight. Then he also says we can't be dashing into situations for which we aren't yet prepared. So there's a number of things. So first must know yourself, but then in order to really know yourself, you have to meet with the world. So he says that the more you meet with the world, the more that you experience it in different situations, the more you'll have an idea and more of an understanding of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and you can't expect to be perfect immediately. You must endure a sort of winter training, and at the end, but you can't be dashing into situations for which you aren't yet prepared. So the reason I'm struggling here is because there's this this sort of twofold: go out into the world and meet situations in order to know yourself and know your strengths and weaknesses and train yourself to be a better person. But at the end, on the other hand, he says, but you can't just dash out into situations for which you aren't prepared. So I think what's being said there is take into account everything we previously discussed about knowing yourself and learning about yourself. And then what he's saying now is to know that first, to reason about yourself and who you want to be, to know yourself and your value before you go out into the world, and to have really reasoned it through so that when you get into those situations, you're not just at a loss. But how could you reason to prepare for a trying situation until you've met the trying situation itself? But I guess that would come from knowing your character and knowing how your character would dictate that you're going to behave. So, alright, so my conclusion on how to preserve one's character in any situation is to first endeavor to know oneself. You must gauge what to you is reasonable, what kind of character is reasonable to you, what kind of person do you want to be, and to make your choices in the world for whatever comes up, to always make them in line with the kind of person you want to be. So if something comes to you or some situation happens that would compromise your character in some way, or for which you'd have to give up some part of being who you want to be in order to do it, you should gauge what's on the other end of it. Will I be a better person for doing it, or will I be a fundamentally lesser person for doing it? As with, for example, Socrates. Socrates perceived himself as he would have been a lesser person if he had evaded death. So to give up who he was, a respectful citizen of Athens, would be it would be a fate worse than death. So you must know yourself and at what your character is and at what rate you're willing to sell that character. But in order to do that, to know what rate, you have to first know yourself. And if you don't truly know yourself, you'll be, haphazardly going around the world making decisions that aren't necessarily for yourself because you're not really entirely sure to begin with what you are or what it would be to be for yourself, or what an action would be to be against yourself, or if you don't have an idea of who you are, you don't have a consciousness of how the things you do that are negative or positive are adding to or taking away from you maybe at some level, or you can't truly know the impact doing things that are semi-intolerable is on your character if you don't truly know your character. But at the same time, you have to experience yourself in different situations to grow skilled at preserving your character. And you can't expect to be your own hero overnight. You need to work at it over time. So what is the simple answer to preserving your character? That's what I'm trying to get at here. To determine who you are, and then act in accordance with it. That is the end of this session of Epictetus. I think that's a good conclusion to get to. I mean, albeit intuitive, but, clear cut. So, see ya.
I let myself be vulnerable. I hold myself responsible for letting you stick pins into my heart. In retrospect, the younger me was too lovesick and dumb to see